Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased and honored to welcome William Jefferson Clinton, the 42nd President of the United States, again among us. Mr. No. Again among us. Mr. President, we had the pleasure to welcome you in the past years. You came first when you still were acting president. We really appreciate your friendship and your partnership, and we felt that it would be very appropriate this afternoon, after so many political discussions which we had, to conclude in some ways. The trade session will follow, and it is a very important session, and I ask you all to be present. But to conclude our, in French you would say, tour d'horizon, with the input and the wisdom and the experience of a man whom we certainly have great respect for. We will run this session as a dialogue, and the first question which I would like to ask you, if you look at the world today, what are the three most important worries which you have? And of course, probably we have discussed those worries during the last days, but we would like to have your point of view.
First, I worry about climate change. It's further in the distance than the other worries that people have, but it is the only thing that I believe has the power to fundamentally end the march of civilization as we know it and make a lot of the other efforts we're making irrelevant and impossible. And I believe that there should be a serious global effort to develop a clean energy future. I don't think we should be talking about it in terms of how we all have to make these great sacrifices in order to preserve the planet for our children and grandchildren. I think that it's actually an economic necessity. If we're going to have enough capacity on Earth to give China and India and other countries the growth which they rightfully claim is theirs, and revive the American economy and provide an opportunity for Europe to continue to grow and integrate in prosperity, I think we have to deal with it. So it's the thing that I worry most about over the long run. And in the short run, the thing I think we could do the most about, if we spent even remotely the same amount of money, either through tax incentives or other investments that we have spent in the last 50 years developing more traditional energy sources. And I think that the quick paybacks are more in conservation than they are even in the development of wind and solar and other things. Second thing that I worry about very much is a cluster of issues that essentially relate to the way the global world works to aggravate rather than ameliorate inequality. I don't think we've found a way to promote economic and political integration in a manner that benefits the vast majority of people in all societies and makes them feel that they are benefited by it. I think that is profoundly important. And in the end, if you want to promote democracy and you believe in it, then you have to understand that voters usually see these grand political issues through the prism of their own experience, how it impacts themselves, their families, their communities, how they imagine their children will live. All you have to do is read the interviews of all the people in the West Bank and Gaza that voted for Hamas in the last election. You know, once in a blue moon, you'll find one. If you really exhaustively look, and I've pulled up a lot of the press on it, once in a while you'll find somebody who says, you know, I voted for those guys because I want to wipe Tel Aviv off the face of the earth. And for every one that said that, there's 100 that says, well, we gave the other guys a chance and we're not doing very well. And these guys come to work early, they run an honest shop, they seem pretty confident to us. What in the wide world is wrong with giving them a chance? So I worry about that. I worry about all these grand ideas that we all promote here working to benefit ordinary people. And that's one of the reasons I appreciate so much what Mr. Gates and others have done on AIDS and tuberculosis, malaria, the work that we do. My foundation is now treating 250,000 people through our drug contract, working with other countries. I think this is important because if ordinary people don't perceive that our grand ideas are working in their lives, then they can't develop the higher level of consciousness, if I can use a kind of a touchy-feely word that the American philosopher Ken Wilber wrote a whole book about called A Theory of Everything. He said, you know, the problem is the world needs to be more integrated, but it requires a consciousness that's way up here and ability to see beyond the differences among us. So I worry about that making the global society work for the poor as well as the non-poor and work for the people who are in distress in the rich countries. I think it's very important for all of you. I think it's a phony debate. I don't mean to be disparaging, but there was a lot of press coverage on how China and India should be handled. Did they present a threat to the West? And then very articulate people representing those countries said quite rightly that we had no right to deny them their day in the sun and their people had a right to make a good living and have a good future. I completely agree with that. The only point I want to make is that the support in the United States for helping them have that future won't persist unless we can do something about the growing concentration of wealth at the top in America, the stagnant wages in the middle, and rising poverty, and people's perception that it is somehow tied to economic growth in India and China. It's not actually necessarily so, but we have to recognize that this is a huge challenge. And then the third big challenge I see is finding a way to bridge the legitimate and apparently irreconcilable religious and cultural differences in the world that are manifest most stunningly in headlines about terrorist actions, but really go far beyond that. You really can't have a global economy or a global society or a global approach to health and other things unless there is some sense of global community. And that requires us to see that our common humanity is more important than our differences. And it is difficult when, the president of Iran says that the Holocaust didn't occur. And when even the moderates in Iran see developing nuclear weapons as an important part of national prestige and say we're hypocrites if we try to stop them from doing it because the technology process began when we were supporting the Shah, and which is not untrue. So I think that this is a time when we need to, all of us, find as few demons as possible and find as many solutions as possible. And we need to basically try to agree on a common set of facts, even if we have a different approach to them, and deal with climate change, global inequalities in economics, education, and healthcare, and these enormous cultural and religious divides that still are bedeviling us. Those are the three things that I think are most important.
Mr. President, if I take your first worry, climate change, there was some discussions during these meetings that actually we concentrate a lot of efforts to solve the issues related to climate change, but actually that water shortage and possible consequences of this water shortage, like wars to fight for water, are probably an even more serious and immediate issue.
Well, actually, I've done quite a bit of work on that. I think it's certainly more immediate. 1 in 4 people have no access to clean water. And 1 in 4 deaths every year come from AIDS, TB, and malaria, and infections related to diarrhea. Almost all in the last category are little kids that never get a clean glass of water. I do think it's a serious thing, but I think it's also closely related to poverty and environmental degradation. So if there were a serious effort to promote sustainable development in all these places where there's a water shortage, clearly rebuilding the stocks of clean water and protecting those that exist would be at the heart of it. There's no question that it's a huge problem and causes all kinds of other problems. But I think that it should be. I don't see how you could have a sustainable development policy, an environmental policy, or even an economic growth policy, and you certainly couldn't have a health policy for a developing country if clean water weren't a part of it.
Mr. President, if I come back to your second comment and your second worry, the inequality, we have a global system, a global governance system, which is actually built on organizations where still based on nation states, and where we tend to defend our national interests and finally arrive at a kind of compromise if we are happy, which doesn't even happen in many cases. So there's nobody who really acts as a global trustee. What institutions can we develop for the 21st century in order to be really capable to respond to global challenges?
Well, I think my view is there's no single answer to that. One of the problems that you have with the United Nations is it's basically the product of a whole lot of different nation states, and therefore will inevitably be hamstrung by some of the conflicts, particularly if they're manifest within the Security Council and especially within the Permanent Five. I mean, if you just take the Iranian issue, for example, whether we want to in fact impose sanctions on Iran or not, if they think the world community is willing to do it, it would have a huge impact on whether they would be willing to let Russia reprocess their nuclear materials and therefore keep bomb-making capacity out of the country, if they thought we had the capacity to do it. But as long as they think that countries that want their oil won't vote for that, or countries like China with a strong history for their own reasons, not all of them good, but some of them good, of non-intervention in the affairs of nations, then they have more room to be belligerent because the military options are not good and carry collateral political consequences. So, but having said that, I think we should keep trying to work to empower and modernize the United Nations. The real problem that a lot of people have with the United Nations, this sort of overlapping bureaucracies and all these criticisms you have, the truth is, from the end of World War II until the end of the Cold War, that was built in for a reason. It was thought that actually the talking function of the UN and the letting off steam functioning and all the mediating that was done by these layers of people that came in and did all this stuff had a value in and of itself. It's easy for us to forget, but in 1945, when the war ended, people thought the next big problem was more bombs were going to fall in the conflict between nations. That avoiding nuclear war in the midst of Cold War was the most important thing. And we forget that, so that if all people did was talk, that's really bad now, you know. That's why, you know, I do what I do, Gates does what he does. You know, if all people do is talk, it's bad. But in 1946, if all people did was talk, it was good. Look how many people died in the 2 world wars, in the period between the wars, and how traumatized the world was with the development of nuclear weapons. So we still have not, in my view, we don't have an international organization that is properly organized to meet its challenges. We tried to do a lot of work on reform of the UN, and we worked with the Congress when I was president, and we finally worked out a deal with where even everybody from Dick Holbrooke to Jesse Helms agreed on paying the UN dues finally. But there are real problems there. You can say, well, I mean, I bet you not everybody in this audience knows, for example, that Kofi Annan has absolutely no control over huge chunks of the UN budget, that those agencies are totally independent. So I think my own view is, to go back to your specific question, Klaus, I think we should ask ourselves, before we need another institution, we should ask ourselves the following questions. What do we still need to do with the UN? What do we still need to do with the international financial institutions? How can we, when we make a commitment like the Global Fund on AIDS, TB, and malaria, how can we make it work? And then we ought to deal with what you and I do for a living now. How can we increase the number of NGOs in the developed and developing world and get more synergies and increase their collective impact? Because I do think a lot of the world's work, if you believe there's a global society, then a lot of the world's work ought to be done by private citizens, because that's where a lot of the money is, and because a lot of the work we do is more cost effective. For example, if you take the American AIDS program, the United States cannot put an AIDS director on the ground in another country for less than about $400,000 a year. By the time they hire a director, pay the government salary, buy the house, buy the transportation, provide the security that's necessary, we can do it for about 80. And that's no criticism of President Bush. It'd be no different if we had a Democratic president. It's just a fact. It's just the way it works. And I could give you lots of other examples. So I think I would say keep working on the UN, explore whether the UN should have a permanent subscription of peacekeeping forces, not real bodies, but every country committing a certain number of people and training and working together. Second, look on the other institutions and ask yourself whether they need to continue to be modernized. And then third, make these big international commitments, the Global Fund and the GA commitment on debt relief, are the most important now, work. And fourth, figure out how to keep exploding the NGO movement and increasing its effectiveness. I think that this is a big example of what the problems you've got with the European Union now are. And also the kind of debate you're having about what kind of politics should dominate the future of the Middle East. When you come clashing into bigger and bigger spheres of contact and you're not told what to do by an autocracy, then you have to figure out how to do this stuff in fits and starts and just keep going. You got to kind of make it up as you go along if you're animated by a good vision. I would imagine Mr. Gates, if you ask him what's the difference in what he knows now and when he started, what's the difference in what he wants to do now and when he started, he would give you a very different answer. I know I would. I didn't have a clue when I started my foundation that it would unfold as it has.
What you just said, Mr. President, is sounds nearly like an opportunity-driven approach. Now, if I relate it to your last worry, where you said, how do we create the right value system? And I see in the audience here one of the biggest proponents of, let's say, world conscious Elie Wiesel, fighting so much for mutual understanding. Now, should the world be opportunity-driven and, let's say, pragmatic? Do we want to solve those issues in a pragmatic way? Or do we need to be more value-driven? And if value-driven, what values?
With all respect, I think it's a false choice. If by opportunity-driven, you're driven by money only or profits only, and they're short-term, you do have values.
I should say problem-solution-driven.
Those are your values. I mean, every organization has value. You know, Richard Branson's out there. He told me that it was before the last election, but we were in the Middle East together not very long ago, and he said if I was working with Mr. Perez and some others on economic opportunities in Gaza, and he said he had actually put a Virgin store there and let the people in the Middle East figure out what kind of music he was supposed to sell. if he does that, he probably won't make any money. Might get blown up. But in the meanwhile, some people will have jobs that wouldn't have it, and they'll acquire a stake in a stable future. And whether the mayor of their community is Hamas or Fatah, they will be less likely to tell their kids they should go to heaven as quick as they can by packing a bomb to their body. So we have to work this out. I think, look, I believe in free market economics. I was once criticized in the House Democratic Caucus as being the most conservative Democratic president since Grover Cleveland. And then when I told the guy I felt deeply complimented, he was, well, it was an unusual thing. So, I mean, I believe in market economics, but I also believe that every person who makes money in the global market or a local market should understand that in order for the market system to survive, you have to increasingly expand the circle of potential customers, potential workers, and the stability of the environment in which you work and live. And therefore, in a certain way, to go back to Thomas Jefferson's first inaugural and modify it a little bit, we're all Republicans and we're all Democrats. Which is not to say we shouldn't have big debates, but you know, I get tickled when if my wife talks about national security, they act like some people say that's not a Democratic issue. If John McCain who's here, does this, I think, I don't want to, I'll get him in trouble if I brag on him. I told Mr. Zellick I practically ruined him among Republicans, telling everybody. But when John McCain goes around the world saying that we have a moral obligation to deal with global warming because, you know, if we burn up the planet, it won't matter how big our armies are. I mean, I don't, it seems to me that we still will have lots of right of center, left of center arguments about the mechanisms by which we can pursue certain goals, and that will keep all societies healthy, vibrant. But if we deny, to go back to your values questions, if our values don't include the things which enable us as a community, right? Davos, Switzerland, the EU, the world, the larger circles of community of which we're a part, to do well, then we do have values, and they're the wrong ones.
Yeah. The problem which we have in the world is probably to match our different identities and not to see them as contradictions, the local identity which we need, a national and a global identity. What can we do to create a better global identity of people? Not governments now, people. What can we do?
Well, I think a lot of it is personal contact. I don't want to be naive here, but a man who worked for me and worked for my Republican predecessors in the Middle East peace team, Aaron Miller, has a remarkable daughter named Jennifer, who's a writer in Rhode Island, who's just written a book about her experiences in the Middle East beginning in 1993 with a group called Seeds of Peace, which brings together, a lot of you know about Seeds of Peace. It started with young Jewish Israelis and young Arab Israelis and Palestinians, now encompasses people in the rest of the Middle East, and they've done some work in the Balkans, work in Northern Ireland. But it does change your perspective. It doesn't necessarily change your position, but it changes your perspective. If you change your perspective without changing your position, it becomes harder at least to kill somebody instead of try to work through a principle compromise in any given context. And, you know, I have to say, I'll give you a little self-criticism here. Anybody who becomes president and deals with foreign policy never wants to look weak and never wants to look naive. God forbid, right? So one of the things you do is you look around Washington for all these deeply embedded practices about what the politically correct way to handle X, Y, and Z. And you know if you deviate from the politically correct way, particularly if you were me and you'd not been in the military, like Senator McCain or Senator Kerry or any number of other people with military record, have a little more room, but not all that much more, to deviate from the politically correct things. So one of the politically correct things in American politics is that, and it may be the right thing, you may decide, but you're going to see it now in the real challenge the Bush administration has in deciding how to respond to the elections in the Palestinian areas. One of our politically correct things is we just don't talk to some people that we don't like, or particularly if they've ever killed anybody in a way that we really hate. And it's a morally highly defensible position. But the question is, who is anybody? For example, should we have more person-to-person contact with Iranians? Not the president, the Iranians. Should we have more person-to-person contact with others? My instinct is that I should have promoted more of that than I did when I was president. That I was a little too hemmed in, given the fact that we've got to try to find a way at least to get other people, understand them, than I should have been. And again, I don't want to be naive and I don't want to be weak even in my dotage, and I'm not in office anymore. But I do think that if you got enough self-confidence in who you are and what you believe in, you ought not to be scared to talk to anybody. I don't think. So I personally believe that's one of the errors I made. And I'm not trying to say this is easy, but it's really hard to get beyond all the little boxes by which we define ourselves and into which we put our adversaries. And you don't really want to give them up because we're glad we're who we are, but you got to find a way to at least open doors through the boxes so you can get to where the other person is. And I don't see how we can do it without more contact.
Mr. President, you referred already to Iran, to the elections in Palestine. We had a discussion on Iraq just preceding our discussion here. If you were president in terms of those three areas, is there anything which you would like to do immediately now?
There are always things any president would like to do immediately, and they're almost impossible to do with hard problems. Let me answer directly. On the Iraq issue, I think it has for years been largely irrelevant whether you believe it was right or wrong for the United States to attack Iraq and depose Saddam Hussein at the time and in the manner in which it was done. Because once it was done, the entire world acquired a stake in the success of the enterprise, with success being defined as a stable, coherent, functioning state in Iraq, so less repressive and more representative than Saddam Hussein was, and sufficiently capable of providing security to its own people and preventing Iraq from becoming a base from which terrorists could operate. Hillary and Chelsea and I went to Israel for the 10th anniversary of Yitzhak Rabin's death and the opening of his Peace Center. And then we went up to Jordan to walk in one of the hotel lobbies where the terrorist bombs of Mr. Zarqawi, running the franchise for al-Qaeda out of the Sunni section of Iraq. Those bombs exploded, killing only Muslims, including people at a wedding reception. And I'm walking around on all that broken grass, thinking about all those dead people, and going to the hospital and seeing a doctor tend to a 4-month-old baby that was his own child. And the doctor had been in the hospital and couldn't go to the wedding reception, so his wife and mother took his little baby there, and he lost his wife and he lost his mother-in-law, and he was left alone to raise this 4-month-old child. It seems to me that anybody who had seen that would say, you know, it'd really be a good thing in the world if this Iraq deal worked. So I think my own view is that it needs to be a fact-driven process. My instinct is, since 2/3 of the Iraqis and all factions have said in some form or fashion they want us to leave when it's appropriate to do so, since we don't tend to get killed over there when we're fighting, but when we're moving around, there may be something to drawing down some of our troops and reconfiguring the components to try to increase the kind of special forces-like intelligence capabilities as well, and putting them in places where they're not quite as vulnerable to be blown up when they're moving around. But I believe that we shouldn't just precipitously give this thing up and say it can't work. You heard these Iraqis who were here more than I did, but there's a lot of them believe that they can work somehow. We may not like everything that comes out of the Iraqi political process, just like most of us might not have put the Hamas in charge of the Palestinians, but you know, if this thing works, it'd be a good thing for everybody in the Middle East. And if it doesn't, it'll be trouble. So we need to quit arguing about what should or shouldn't have been done before and really just look at it. Now, on Iran, I don't see that at the present time neither the president nor the rest of the world has have any particularly pleasant options. The fundamental problem in Iran is it's the only country in the world with two governments. And it was the only country in the world, I can say this as a Democrat, I love to say this, it's the only country in the world when during my time in office, they had 6 elections in a row where the progressives got 2/3 to 70% of the votes. They had 2 elections for president, 2 elections for the parliament, the modulates, and 2 elections for mayors. Now, what happened? The second government, that is the government run by the religious council under the Ayatollah Khamenei, excuse me. Khatami was the president, Khamenei. They have the power to invalidate laws passed by Congress, scratch candidates off the ballot, and they control the money that funds the intelligence and also the terrorist operations and training. So, and that third is what we relate to and what we feel threatened by and what our friends in the region do. But the trick is to figure out how to weaken the hold of that third without alienating the other 2/3 of the Iranians. Now, you may say, well, your analysis is no longer right. Look at this guy they elected president. Go look at how he got elected. It's just like the Hamas deal. He ran as a conservative populist. He says, Khatami failed you. All those reformers never did anything. Well, of course, they couldn't because they kept getting gutted by the religious crowd. But anyway, he said, vote for me and I will write you a check. Go back and look. It was a pretty, the guy could have run for mayor of an American city. Vote for me. No, you go back and look what he said. Vote for me. We got all this oil money. You're not getting it. I control it. If you make me president, I'll write you a check. Go back and look at the campaign. And a lot of people said our plight is getting worse. What have we got to lose? And maybe he stole the election. I don't know. There's still some dispute about that. But whether he did or not, a whole lot of people voted for him. And so I think that's still the dilemma. The world would be a much more dangerous place and the Middle East would be rendered more unstable if they acquire usable weapons of mass destruction. They are 3 times the size of Iraq, and they got money, but they also have serious economic and social problems. So I've been inclined here just to support, first of all, exhausting all diplomatic means. But I also think that the United States should be working very hard on our relationships with Russia, India, and China particularly. Countries, in the case of India and China, that may need that oil, but also need oil from somewhere else. And on our other neighbors, Iran's neighbors, to try to keep maximum pressure so that the president's problems in delivering within the country are aggravated as long as he stays an international outcast in effect. And I think we have to do that and not rule out the sanctions at the UN and not rule out any other option. But we should know that there will likely be we shouldn't jump to the last option first because we've got a few years here before this can be done. And there would be, in my view, an enormous political price to pay if the global community took a looked like they went to force before everything else had been exhausted, especially given the other fish we have to fry in Afghanistan and Iraq. But it is a very difficult problem. So that's what I think about that. In the Middle East, I think I understand the President's position that we shouldn't deal with Hamas or give them money until they renounce their that portion of their political doctrine that advocates the destruction of Israel. But it took the Palestinian Authority several years before they took it out of their charter, even after they signed the peace agreement. So we've got to be practical here, and we need to work very closely with the Israelis. And it's obvious that, to me anyway, that Mr. Olmert and his group have taken a kind of a clear-headed and reasonable view about this development, and that it was to some extent predictable. And they may wind up like the IRA and Sinn Féin, where they first of all say there's going to be peace, we're not going to do violence, and you know, it took us a long time. It took, how many umpty-dumpty years after we had the first ceasefire, then 95 and 98 was the peace agreement, and it wasn't until last year that they agreed to get rid of all their weapons, and they did that even though there was no standing government in Northern Ireland they hadn't gotten back. And why did that happen? Because the public did not want it. Their own constituents did not want violence. They did not want to go back to terror. So what we're going to have to do here is to see whether these idealistic young people who voted for them and who serve in their ranks not for terror but for reasons of competence, delivery of public service, faithful representation of the people, all that sort of stuff, whether they start to deliver the goods, and if they do, whether they acquire a greater sense of responsibility, and as they do, we have to be willing to act on that. And I sure don't think we need to get out in a more extreme position than the Israelis are on it. And they've taken so far, a pretty disciplined, restrained reaction.
Mr. President, you have been very much engaged together with former President Bush in humanitarian relief actions, first after the Asian tsunami and afterwards after the Gulf hurricanes. What did you learn out of this process, and how do you feel humankind is reacting towards those catastrophes, and how can we make sure that the wave of solidarity which we have seen immediately in the aftermath can be maintained?
Well, first of all, I think I learned that there, once again, that people all over the world, not just in the United States and Europe, but all over the world, are incredibly, good and generous when people are in trouble, and they gave them a lot of money. And I learned that there are a lot of incredibly devoted people who do this work for our government, for the EU, for the Asian governments, and for the international organizations. I think that some of it could be a little better organized, and I've tried to do that by taking this UN role in the aftermath of the tsunami. I have learned something I didn't know when these things happened and when Katrina happened, which is that the insurance losses from natural disasters in the last decade are 3 times any previous decade in history in constant dollars, which is another argument for the reality of climate change. I learned the most important political lesson I learned had nothing to do with anything that former President Bush and I did, except that we represented the American people. America was not in good shape in Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim country, when that tsunami hit. Our approval rating in the most recent published poll before the tsunami was 36%. After the tsunami, the same people went back and did another poll, it was 60%. And the only reason people cited for their change of behavior was the behavior of the United States military, the AID, and the civilian, both religious and non-religious, non-governmental organizations. In other words, we saw them as people and they saw us as people. Now, I don't want to be naive. I know a lot of things happen in moments of crisis. I saw the Turks and the Greeks embracing after the earthquakes there when I was president. But it had a huge impact. And the other thing that was interesting, Mr. bin Laden approval dropped from 58 to 28% in Indonesia. And he was not noticeably involved in bringing on the tsunami. But he did not do anything for them. Only we did, not we the Americans, we the rest of the world. And you know, when your back's against the wall and your kids are dead and your house is flattened and you don't know where you're going to go again, all of a sudden with stunning clarity, you know it takes a lot more to build a house than to tear one down. And so to me, it made the work, Gordon Brown was just here, I saw Jack Straw, the work of the G8, all this debt relief business of helping the poor countries, the new initiatives and the health care, that's a lot more important because, look, nobody ever, we shouldn't assume that any societies are monoliths. The average person who's just thinking and looking at things unfold, who lives in Yemen or Mozambique or Bolivia, where they just elected that enterprising Indian fella president, fascinating to me. They don't judge us by whether they agree with everything that we do, America or the EU, or whether everything the president says is something they agree with. They basically want to know we're on their side. Not that we agree with us on everything. They want to know that we're people, that we wish them well, that we want the best for them, that we're pulling for them. They're smart enough to figure out that we can't possibly, we have our politics, they have theirs, we have our views, they have theirs, we can't possibly agree on everything, but they get a feeling whether we're all kind of headed in the same direction and we're pulling for them. That's what you want.
President Clinton, we both believe very much in the notion of public-private partnerships, and you have undertaken remarkable initiatives in your Clinton Global Initiative, which you started. By the way, we discussed how we could cooperate even more closely together. What is your learning out of public-private partnerships? Is it sufficiently recognized by governments and also by the business communities, the force which could come out of combining the best of both assets and resources?
I would say it's more recognized than ever.
I would agree.
Is it sufficiently recognized? Goodness no, because we're behind the 8 ball on a lot of these things. We had another 4.9 million people infected with HIV last year. But is it making a difference? Yes. I don't want to embarrass him, but you know, if Botswana is the richest country in sub-Saharan Africa, and I do not believe it would have survived if the Gates Foundation had not gone in there. Because I don't think a society standing on its own 2 legs can survive with a 30% AIDS infection rate, HIV infection rate. I just don't think it's a sustainable situation. So what I've learned is that the power of private citizens to do public good is greater than at any time in history because of globalization and the sharing of information and contacts, because of the internet, which allows little guys and women, men and women, guys is a generic term where I come from, to pool their resources and create a pile of money as big as the money that Bill Gates is putting in. You know, we gave Americans gave $1.4 billion to tsunami relief. 30% of American households contributed, half of them over the internet. Per capita giving in the UK and the Netherlands was greater. The Dutch lottery, you all know about the Dutch postal code lottery? It's the best example of using technology to have public aid that I know about. they don't have lottery winners in America like, you know, you got the ticket and you get all the money. Instead, people buy the lottery tickets and then they have a drawing once a month, and they have 2 drawings in December. And the winners, they draw postal codes out. And there's a lot of them. They're like area codes in America, but there are more of them. They're you know, the fewer people, maybe just one block in Amsterdam or one little village. And then everybody in the village that got a ticket, they get a check. But all the profits go to international relief and development efforts. So this is important. So these 2 things have really mattered. And then the rise of the NGO movement itself in developing as well as developed countries. All this has made a difference. I think that it is critical. That's first thing. Second thing is, it's got to be a supplement to, not a substitute for government, because it's where the money is still. You know, it can't be a way for government to walk away, but it can be a very important supplement. And I think the partnerships may be more important because I got tickled when I talked about this. Somebody called me a bleeding heart cheapskate the other day. But I just can't stand to see money wasted. Like our government spent $77 million the other day and announced it to set up a distribution center for the AIDS medicine. And that's how much I spend in my whole program, with all the, and that includes all the money that comes from Ireland, Canada, and other places to go to places. And I thought, well, what about FedEx or UPS? You know, or you know, anything would be cheaper than that. And in many countries, and again, I'm not saying, this kind of thing happened when I was there. This is not a partisan criticism. I'm talking about government mindset as opposed to other options. How can we make limited foreign assistance dollars, public dollars, go further? But in many countries, half the foreign aid money never leaves the shore of the country. In many countries. So I would like to see this year, and I've talked to Prime Minister Blair about this. I've talked to people in the Bush administration about this. I would like to see this year, all the major donors do a serious analysis of how the money that the taxpayers in their countries are already putting up for this is spent, and analyze whether we're saving every life we can save, and rebuilding all the people's lives we can rebuild, and creating all the economic and other opportunity we can create with the money that is being appropriated. And everybody always talks about how we need more money. Look, I believe that, but we also have, I think, a very strong ethical obligation, not only to our own taxpayers, but to the people who need this money to stay alive, to make sure that it's being spent in the most cost-effective way possible. And I think that's one place where the NGO movement can really help.
Mr. President, we unfortunately have to conclude, but I would like to ask you a maybe provocative question. What would be your key advice to the 44th President of the United States? And we may be in a situation where it just may happen that he's sitting here in the room, or she may be married to you. So I think we all would be very interested to hear what your advice would be.
In this world full of culturally charged issues, I think we should make it clear that Senator McCain and I are not married, at least to each other. I think look, oh, we'll be on the news with that tonight. Let me say something very serious. I think that our democracy in our country and many others is always subject to minoring in the majors and majoring in the minors, to people being diverted and divided over issues that are highly emotionally charged but have very little to do with what people do once they get the jobs they're trying to get the voters to give them. And I'm sure in my long elected career I was guilty of that from time to time too. I'm not saying that. But what determines the life of a great country, and increasingly the interconnected life of the world, is whether, with the shifting of time and circumstance, leaders articulate a vision of the future which is consistent with the values of the people and the historic mission of the country, whether they have a strategy to carry it out, and whether they execute it in a way that leaves people better off when they quit than when they started. It's not very complicated to me. In other words, I always figured these elected jobs were jobs just like other jobs. But they were jobs that, and an election, any election, basically a job interview, except the candidate has to define the job as well as apply for it. And so, to me, my only advice would be that in times of great change, ever since 1989, we've basically been, when the Berlin Wall fell, we were in a world that was dominated by a global economy without a global society or a global political system, with a lot of shared problems without the mechanisms to deal with them, with enormous shared opportunities that were unevenly distributed, and with forces of both the positive forces and destructive forces let loose in ways they had never been let loose before because of the breaking down of all these barriers. And we are in the process. Normally it takes even one nation like America or 30 years or so to work this out. I mean, for example, we worked on America's conversion from an agricultural to an industrial economy and what the implications were for government and society at least from the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt through the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt. So, it takes a long time to do these things. So that's why I told my friends in France and the Netherlands not to be discouraged by the defeats of the EU Constitution. This is a massive undertaking that requires enormous psychological as well as practical things. That we can't be discouraged by the setbacks in Africa. And when I saw my friend President Obasanjo talking about all the free elections they had there. It takes time. But I think the most important advice I have is have a vision that's consistent with the mission of the nation and the needs of the country, have a strategy, and just make sure that people are better off when you stop than when you started. The rest of it is a matter of time and circumstance. You can't control whether you do everything you want to do. And the other thing I would say is not every failure is a defeat. That is, I personally don't feel that I failed to pass health care reform. But all you got to do is look at where we are today with 16% of our GDP in America going to health care. And in Switzerland and Canada, the next highest at 11, we're spending almost 50% more of our GDP than anybody else, and we're at basically 37th in overall health ratings, to say that sooner or later we're going to have to do this. And therefore, if all I did was to start a process, I think that's good. So, and if Senator McCain were president, if Hillary were, or anyone else who was passionate about climate change, they still might not be able to get America off the merry-go-round of traditional oil usage, but we got to start. And one thing for sure is, if we were making a serious effort, we'd be better off when they quit than when they started. See, that's the only thing. And so, I know we have to go. Let me I'll leave you this. Since I'm in Europe, I want to say this. People ask me all the time, what's the most important lesson I ever learned in politics? And there's no way to answer that, I don't think. But Machiavelli said that there is nothing so difficult in all of human affairs than to change the established order of things. Because the people who will lose from the change are certain of their loss, and those who will benefit are uncertain of their gain. Hundreds of years later, in 1918, at the dawn of, well, it was the middle of World War I, the German sociologist Max Weber wrote a little essay, about 50 pages long, called Politics is a Vocation. Every young person who comes to me, whatever their politics, talk about politics, I implore them to read it. Weber says basically, politics is the long and slow boring of hard boards. And that anytime you exercise power, you're sort of playing God, which means that you're putting your soul at risk. He was a deeply religious Christian Democrat, small d. And he basically said, you just have to keep doing it. But you have to believe that progress is possible. You have to not be deterred by defeat, but you have to be humble all along, because none of us are as smart as we think we are. And that's basically what I've learned. I don't get discouraged now when things happen that I can't stand. I get mad sometimes. But I think that, you know, this is human beings have always been complicated, and the circumstances of the world are more complicated than ever before. But there has still never been a time when both private citizens and public officials have the potential to shape a world of peace and prosperity any greater than today. It is still more likely than not that the 21st century will be far less bloody than the 20th. It is still more likely than not that there will be more widely shared prosperity within the next few decades than ever before in human history. Could we screw it up if we let AIDS eat us alive? Yes. Could we go back to an ice age if we don't do something about global warming? Absolutely. But, you know, I have to hope that the world will be like Winston Churchill said America was when we didn't come into World War II for 2 or 3 years, and the press used to debate him. He said, oh, America always does the right thing after exhausting every other alternative. And you know, it may be that's where the world is now. We're building something we never had to build before. So don't be discouraged, and don't use your political disappointments as an excuse to avoid personal commitment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.